At just 16, Jonathan Dawson wore a school blazer by day and buried his 10-year-old maid, Lila, beneath his family's basement by night. In a quiet, well-guarded neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia, stood the grand Dawson residence, an architectural masterpiece with glass walls, marble floors, and an air of perfection. It was the kind of house that made people slow their cars to admire it. Inside lived the Dawsons, a successful, upper-class family with a spotless reputation. Jonathan Dawson, their only child, was the kind of teenager every parent dreamed of. At just 16, he was top of his class, captain of the school debate team, and the face of every school brochure. Teachers praised him, classmates envied him, and his social media portrayed the perfect life: weekend brunches, award ceremonies, gym selfies, and charity events. But what no one knew was that Jonathan's perfection was only skin deep. Beneath that charming exterior, something darker had been growing. The Dawsons had recently hired a young maid named Lila. She was only 10 years old, sent from a struggling family in a rural part of the state. With no documents, no schooling, and no legal protection, she arrived at the mansion with a small bag and big eyes. Her family, lured by the promise of a steady income and better living conditions for their daughter, believed this opportunity could save them. They couldn't have been more wrong. Lila's job was simple: clean the kitchen, sweep the marble floors, water the indoor plants, and stay out of sight. She wasn't allowed at the dining table, and she never joined the family for outings. Her room was a small utility space near the laundry area. She woke up before everyone else and slept long after they had gone to bed. The Dawsons rarely spoke to her. She was just the help. Jonathan, however, noticed her almost immediately. But it wasn't out of kindness or curiosity. He noticed the way she flinched at loud noises, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she obeyed without question. She didn't push back, didn't talk back, didn't matter to anyone. That made her different from everyone else in Jonathan's life. At school, Jonathan was adored but bored. At home, he was praised but disconnected. Lila became a new focus for his attention. At first, he would leave small messes for her to clean up, just to see how quickly she responded. Then he started testing her, knocking things over near her, locking her out of the kitchen, moving her belongings. She never complained, and that silence stirred something dangerous inside him. On the outside, everything looked the same. Jonathan still smiled in family photos. The Dawsons still hosted weekend parties. Lila still served drinks in silence. But under the surface, a twisted game had begun, one that no one saw coming. The golden boy of the neighborhood had found a secret world where he was in complete control, and Lila, voiceless and powerless, had unknowingly become a part of something much darker than anyone could imagine. What began as quiet observations and small manipulations was about to spiral into something irreversible, and by the time anyone noticed, it would be far too late. It started with little things, details so minor that no one paid attention. A bruise on Lila's wrist that looked like she had bumped into a doorknob, a faint scratch along her cheek that she claimed came from a cat. Her eyes, once wide with curiosity, now seemed distant and dull. Mrs. Dawson rarely looked closely, and when she did, she chalked it up to Lila's clumsiness. After all, she was just a child from the village, not used to polished floors and heavy furniture. No one questioned anything. Jonathan had become more curious about what he could get away with. He began pushing the line gradually, always under the mask of innocence. He knew exactly when the security cameras were disabled for cleaning. He understood when his parents would be out for meeting. He calculated every moment of Lila's day, and she, terrified but unsure of how to escape, endured it all in silence. She had no phone, no friends, and no voice in this place. Soon, Lila stopped speaking altogether. She no longer hummed to herself while cleaning. She began walking slower, her steps lighter, almost like she was trying to disappear into the walls. Her tiny frame grew thinner, her skin paler. The change was invisible to the Dawsons, who rarely interacted with her beyond giving orders or dismissing her presence. But a few neighbors started to notice something wasn't quite right. One neighbor in particular, an elderly woman, who often walked her dog past the Dawson home, saw Lila outside one morning barefoot and shivering. She stood on the edge of the garden like she didn't know if she was allowed to be there. The woman waved, but Lila quickly turned away. That image stayed in her mind, and a few days later she called Child Protective Services. They responded promptly and visited the Dawson home. The investigator arrived to find a clean, well-maintained house with well-dressed, charming homeowners. Jonathan, smiling and polite, offered the agent water and walked her through the house. Everything appeared perfect. When Lila was questioned, she said nothing out of fear. Her hands trembled, but she forced a smile. The caseworker, without physical evidence or a confession, closed the file with a warning and left. Jonathan had watched the visit from the staircase, listening to every word. That night, Lila didn't eat. She locked herself in the small supply closet and cried silently until morning. Her eyes were puffy, but she got up the next day and cleaned the house as if nothing had happened. Jonathan now felt invincible. No one suspected him, not even the authorities. He had outsmarted the system, and in doing so his cruelty grew darker. He began keeping a journal of everything he did, writing down his thoughts, planning his next moves. The journal wasn't hidden, it was locked inside his drawer, placed neatly next to his school textbooks. He knew no one would think to look. And then, without any warning, Lila was gone. One morning, the kitchen was quiet. Her mop leaned untouched against the wall. Her bed was made. Her shoes were still by the back door. But she wasn't there. And no one, not even the Dawsons, could explain where she had gone. Lila's disappearance was met with an eerie quietness. The Dawsons told their neighbors that she had probably run away, maybe returned to her family in the village. Mrs. Dawson casually mentioned that Lila had seemed overwhelmed and was likely not ready for city life. Jonathan stayed silent, never offering a word about her absence, and when asked at school, simply shrugged it off. Because Lila was undocumented, no official record of her employment or residence existed. Her name wasn't on school rolls, and there were no hospital visits, no photographs, no formal paper trail. Legally, she had never even been there. A missing persons report was eventually filed, not by the Dawsons, but by the neighbor who had reported concerns weeks earlier. She couldn't shake the image of Lila's thin frame and vacant eyes. However, with little evidence and no strong leads, the case stalled quickly. Police marked it as a likely runaway case, and within weeks, it faded from attention. The Dawson house returned to its normal rhythm, but something inside its walls was not normal anymore. 3 weeks after Lila vanished, a plumbing issue brought a maintenance worker into the Dawson home. The kitchen sink had begun leaking into the lower basement. It was routine, just another call. The plumber, trying to access a pipe beneath the basement floor, moved a heavy cabinet that had been tightly wedged into a corner. It scratched against the tile as he slid it aside. Behind the cabinet, he noticed a discolored portion of the floor, and an odd smell, faint but distinct. It wasn't the odor of mold or mildew. It was something heavier, something unnatural. Beneath the rug covering that area, the plumber found reddish-brown stains on the wood, small but deeply soaked in. He paused, uncertain, and then quietly stepped outside to call the police. When officers arrived with a warrant the next morning, they began a thorough search of the home. The Dawsons cooperated but looked confused. Jonathan sat calmly on the living room couch, watching the officers move from room to room without saying a word. In the crawl space beneath the basement stairs, where the air was cold and dry, the police dogs alerted almost instantly. Beneath a thin layer of concrete, recently poured, they found the small, contorted body of a child. Forensic investigators carefully removed the remains and confirmed the worst. The body belonged to Lila. An autopsy revealed extensive internal injuries, consistent with prolonged abuse. Her ribs had been fractured, several teeth were missing, and blunt force trauma to the head was determined to be the cause of death. She had likely died days before she disappeared. Her body had been hidden in the home all along, buried beneath their feet while life above continued as if nothing had happened. News of the discovery spread rapidly. The neighborhood that once praised the Dawsons now stood in disbelief. Reporters swarmed the gates, flashing cameras through the iron fence. When Jonathan was arrested later that evening, he didn't protest. He didn't ask why. He simply stood up, straightened his shirt, and walked out with the officers as if he had been expecting them. As investigators dug deeper into the Dawson home, the surface-level image of perfection began to crack and fall apart. What once appeared to be a normal, privileged household quickly became the center of one of the most disturbing juvenile murder cases in the state. Detectives seized Jonathan's personal belongings, his phone, laptop, journals, and even items from his school locker. At first glance, it all looked like typical teenage clutter, but buried in his digital world was a carefully documented record of manipulation, cruelty, and obsession. On his laptop were folders labeled with numbers instead of names. Inside them were dozens of videos and photos, some showing Lila cleaning, others captured through hidden angles in hallways and bathrooms. Investigators discovered that Jonathan had been tampering with the home's security cameras, saving footage for himself and even installing his own covert devices in corners the house staff would never check. These recordings showed more than just surveillance. They revealed a calculated pattern of psychological torture. There were also chilling video clips of Jonathan harming small animals in the backyard. He had filmed them from a distance, narrating in a cold, detached voice. Experts later identified this behavior as a clear marker of sociopathy. His internet history was full of searches about human anatomy, hiding evidence, and underage labor laws. One document, a private journal saved as an encrypted file, was especially alarming. It detailed his thoughts, frustrations, and a twisted sense of control he felt over Lila. He referred to her as the subject, describing her behavior, her expressions, and his responses in clinical, emotionless language. The journal read more like an experiment log than a diary. He wrote about isolating her, testing her limits, even punishing her for mistakes she hadn't made. His final entry, written days before her disappearance, mentioned the words "final phase." Investigators believed this indicated premeditation. Lila's death was not accidental, not a loss of control. It had been planned. When the evidence was presented in court, the community gasped. The boy they had praised as brilliant and polite was now being called a cold-blooded killer. His defense attorneys attempted to argue diminished responsibility due to mental illness, but psychiatric evaluations revealed that Jonathan was fully aware of his actions. He had no history of hallucinations or breaks from reality. Instead, he was diagnosed with a high-functioning personality disorder, capable of understanding right and wrong but entirely lacking in empathy or remorse. The prosecution painted Jonathan as a manipulative predator, hiding behind the mask of a model student. The court saw not only the brutal murder of an innocent child, but the long, deliberate build-up to it, an emotional and physical campaign of terror waged by a teenager who understood exactly what he was doing. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. They found him guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and unlawful confinement. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Jonathan showed no emotion. His face remained calm, detached, almost uninterested, as if the outcome didn't matter to him at all. After the trial ended and the cameras turned away, the world moved on, but the shadows of what happened inside the Dawson home remained. Jonathan Dawson, once the symbol of academic excellence and social perfection, was now one of the youngest individuals in the state, serving a life sentence without parole. At just 16, he entered a maximum security juvenile facility, where his cold, emotionless behavior immediately set him apart. He didn't fight with other inmates. He didn't cry, plead, or ask for favors. Instead, he observed. He watched everything and everyone, just like he had watched Lila. Staff members noted how eerily composed he was. He followed the rules, participated in assigned programs, and kept his cell perfectly clean. But there was something unsettling about his calmness. Other inmates displayed anger, guilt, or frustration. Jonathan showed none of that. he kept to himself, spending most of his time reading books on psychology, control, and criminal behavior. He seemed to treat prison not as punishment, but as another controlled environment, another experiment. Over the years, his story became a cautionary tale. Documentaries, news specials, and true crime podcasts all examined how someone so young, from such privilege, could commit such a brutal and calculated act. Experts debated whether society, parenting, or genetics were to blame, but none of them could fully explain the darkness that lived behind Jonathan's calm eyes. Lila's story, however, was often overlooked in these conversations. There were no family press conferences or viral campaigns. Her family, still trapped in poverty, could barely afford to travel for the trial. They received no financial compensation, no public apology. What they got was a phone call, a death certificate, and a child-size casket returned to them without ceremony. Lila became a symbol for the invisible, those who serve quietly, suffer silently, and disappear without warning. Inside prison, Jonathan began writing letters. Not to his parents, who had moved out of state after the trial and never visited him again. Not to friends, he had none left. He wrote to researchers, journalists, and psychologists, offering to help them understand how a mind like his worked. He believed his thoughts were valuable, that his insight into manipulation and control could serve some purpose. Some experts refused to engage, others responded out of professional curiosity. But no one doubted the chilling nature of his words. One letter, later published in a true crime book, read, "She was never afraid of me. She was afraid of being alone. I simply made sure she stayed that way." Years passed. Jonathan turned 18, then 21. His file was marked with restrictions, banning him from ever being placed in a less secure facility. He remained isolated, physically and psychologically, yet he continued to write, filling notebooks with reflections, calculations, and chilling observations. Outside, Lila's story slowly faded from public memory. A small plaque was placed at her gravesite, funded by a local nonprofit. It read only her name and the words, "She mattered." For those who still remember, the horror wasn't just that a young girl was killed, it was that she was forgotten so easily, and her killer remembered so widely.